Mongolia and Indonesia are two nations that seem worlds apart, separated by vast oceans, distinct cultures, and entirely different ways of life. Mongolia, with its expansive steppes and nomadic traditions, and Indonesia, a sprawling archipelago of tropical islands, may appear to have little in common. Yet, in the late 13th century, an extraordinary chapter of history unfolded. The Mongols launched an audacious expedition to Java, one of the key islands of modern-day Indonesia. This episode raises an intriguing question. What could possibly compel the Mongols, renowned conquerors of the Eurasian heartlands, to traverse thousands of miles across treacherous seas to engage with a distant island they had no prior quarrel with? To answer this, we must delve into the broader geopolitical and cultural landscape of East Asia during this period. The late 13th century was a time of unparalleled ambition and expansion for the Mongol Empire, which, under the leadership of Genghis Khan and his descendants, had become the largest contiguous land empire in history. By this time, much of China was under the control of the Yuan dynasty, established by Kublai Khan, a grandson of Genghis Khan. While the Mongols had initially risen as fierce nomadic warriors, their rule over China brought them into close contact with its rich traditions, including its deeply entrenched worldview. China, throughout its imperial history, viewed itself as the Middle Kingdom, the center of the civilized world. This self-perception wasn't merely about geography. It was a reflection of cultural and political superiority. The Chinese believed their empire to be the pinnacle of human achievement, with all other nations existing in the shadow of their greatness. Those beyond China's borders were often deemed barbarians, uncultured and uncivilized, incapable of rivaling the sophistication of Chinese society. This worldview shaped China's foreign policy and its relationships with neighboring states. Rather than forging equal partnerships, China maintained a tributary system. Under this system, other kingdoms were expected to acknowledge China's dominance by paying tribute, a symbolic act of submission that underscored their secondary status. Tributary states would offer gifts and homage to the Chinese emperor, who in turn would bestow titles, gifts, and limited autonomy in return. For the Chinese, this was not merely a political arrangement, but a reaffirmation of their cultural supremacy. When the Mongols assumed control of China, they inherited this tributary system, integrating it into their strategies for regional dominance. For Kublai Khan, enforcing the tributary relationship wasn't just about maintaining China's tradition. It was also a means of legitimizing his rule as the rightful emperor of China. Thanks to its massive economic and military power, China could enforce this tributary system, extracting tributes from nations far and wide. Meanwhile, in Southeast Asia, the Malay archipelago that includes Brunei, East Timor, Indonesia, Malaysia, Papua New Guinea, and the Philippines nowadays, or what was traditionally called Nusantara, was home to a different kind of civilization. The people here, known as Austronesians, became expert sailors because their region consisted of thousands of islands, making sea travel essential. Not only that, but the Malay archipelago sat at a crucial point between India and China, making it a perfect hub for trade. The Austronesians thrived as middlemen, facilitating trade between these two ancient economic giants. But what really made this region rich was its control over the spice trade. Spices like nutmeg, cloves, and pepper were extremely valuable in the pre-industrial world, similar to how crude oil is today. These spices were prized across Asia, the Middle East, and Europe for their ability to enhance food flavors, and kingdoms that controlled the spice trade became incredibly wealthy and powerful. So there were lots of rich kingdoms came and went in the Malay archipelagos. So, to put it simply, in the 13th century, after the Mongols successfully invaded China, Kublai, who was a grandson of Genghis Khan, rebranded itself as the Yuan dynasty and continued the tradition of enforcing Chinese hegemony. It's extracting tribute from surrounding regions. One of these regions happened to be Tumapel, which is more commonly known as Singasari, a name derived from its capital city. This unassuming little kingdom is located on the island of Java, which is part of Indonesia within the Malay archipelago. Unfortunately, the Malay archipelago was traditionally in the zone of Chinese tributary hegemony, so Java naturally became a target for Mongol attention. One of China's traditional ways to demand that they pay tributes and submit themselves to China is to send the envoys to their region. Therefore, in 1279, Kublai sent envoys to Kertanegara, ruler of Java. These envoys requested hostages, specifically family members of the Javanese ruler, to ensure loyalty and submission to Mongol authority. This was a common practice within the tributary system, where powerful states would demand hostages to secure compliance from weaker states. He wasn't having any of it. He flat out ignored them at first. But Kublai's envoys were persistent. They kept showing up, mission after mission. Finally, in 1289, Kertanegara had enough. He snapped. He cut off the ears of one envoy, branded his face, and sent him back as a final message. Pretty brutal, right? Well, Kublai was furious. Harming a Mongol envoy was a serious offense, punishable by war. So, Kublai ordered a punitive expedition against Java. But here's the thing. By this time, the Mongols weren't on a winning streak. Kublai's military campaigns were falling apart left and right. His attempts to invade Japan had been catastrophic, and things went even worse in Vietnam. The Mongol Empire, known for its dominance on land, faced two major hurdles in its campaigns: naval warfare and tropical climates. In Vietnam, the Mongols struggled with the hot, humid tropical climate, which was a far cry from the cold, dry steppes they were used to. The heat caused widespread exhaustion, while diseases like malaria devastated their ranks. Mongol horses, critical to their cavalry-based warfare, could not endure the humid environment, with many dying from heat and disease. The challenging jungle terrain further complicated Mongol logistics, as food supplies spoiled quickly, making it hard for the army to stay well fed. On top of this, the Vietnamese used guerrilla tactics, ambushing Mongol forces in dense forests and rugged mountains, neutralizing their cavalry advantage. In terms of naval warfare, a decisive blow came at the Bac Giang River, where the Mongols got lured into the river by the Vietnamese, who had hidden sharp stakes beneath the water. When the tide went down, the Mongol ships got wrecked by those stakes, and that pretty much crushed any hope of victory. In Japan, the Mongols' lack of naval experience was also laid bare during two failed invasions in 1274 and 1281. Trying to supply massive fleets across the sea was a nightmare for the Mongols. They weren't equipped for it. And then, as if their lack of naval experience wasn't enough, these brutal typhoons, the kamikaze or divine winds, swept in and obliterated their ships, not once, but twice. So this time, Kublai took more care in planning the Java invasion. He made sure the army had a full year's worth of supplies of grain and 40,000 ounces of silver to purchase more supplies, trying to avoid the logistical nightmares of past campaigns. Since the climate in Java was hot and humid, he relied on southern Chinese troops who could better handle the weather. Mongols were in command, but the bulk of the army was Chinese, which wasn't uncommon for Mongol forces by this point. They often used conquered peoples as soldiers. Now, back in Java, the political situation was chaotic. Kertanegara knew it was only a matter of time before the Yuan forces made their move against him. He hastily prepared for battle, and focused on external conquests to expand his kingdom's influence beyond Java. Taking advantage of the fact that a large part of Singasari's military force had left the capital to serve in the campaign, Jayakatwang, the Duke of Kadiri, launched a rebellion that restored Kadiri's independence, taking back the territory Singasari had previously annexed. This uprising marked the end of the Singasari dynasty's 70-year rule, and Kertanegara was killed in the chaos. But one person managed to slip away: Raden Wijaya, Kertanegara's son-in-law. Raden knew he didn't have the resources to challenge Jayakatwang alone, so he sought help from Arya Wiraraja, an old ally of Kertanegara, who had been pushed aside and sent to govern Madura. From then on, Arya harbored a personal grudge against Kertanegara, making him a valuable ally to Jayakatwang. Even though he still helped Raden. With Arya's help, Jayakatwang spared Raden, and he was allowed to establish a new settlement in Tarik, later known as Majapahit. This event marked the beginning of the Majapahit Empire, which would become one of the most powerful and influential empires in Southeast Asian history. Just as things seemed to have calmed down in Java, Kublai Khan's preparations were complete. He immediately ordered his troops to subdue Java with 3 commanders: Gao Xing, Shebi, and Yigmish, on March 1292. The Yuan invasion force in Java was estimated to be around 20,000 to 30,000 soldiers gathered from regions like Fujian, Jiangxi, and Huguang, along with a fleet of 500 ships. Imagine them looking much like the soldiers who had set sail toward Japan not long before. Their armor was lamellar, a traditional East Asian style, with metal or leather plates layered over fabric or leather. Helmets with neck flaps gave extra protection, which was practical for many campaigns, especially in cooler climates. But Java's tropical heat was a whole different experience. With thick humidity and relentless warmth, heavy armor became more of a liability than protection. These soldiers likely took some advice from their comrades who had fought in Vietnam and opted for lighter gear. Too much armor meant risking heat exhaustion, so the troops may have reduced their layers to stay agile and handle the jungle climate. This adaptability to Java's heat shows how the Yuan commanders prioritized mobility, tweaking their usual kit to survive and hopefully thrive in these intense conditions. The Yuan forces departed from the southern port of Quanzhou, did not follow the accustomed course along the coasts of Malacca and Sumatra, but kept further off, boldly taking the shortest road to its destination. This particular navigation course may have followed one of the regular commercial shipping lanes prior to the Yuan dynasty, connecting from Quanzhou to Java via Jai Viet and Champa, islands in southern Vietnam waters, and then the western island chains of Borneo. This military mission, comprising 500 ships and 4,000 kilometers seafaring from Quanzhou to Java, was led by Yigmish, the first Uyghur navigator in Chinese historical records. Only an experienced navigator and diplomat like Yigmish could lead the Mongol fleet along such a route to Java. Yigmish started his official career in 1265, and he completed at least 4 diplomatic missions overseas before the Javan campaign. These missions were launched from China to Southeast India and Sri Lanka in 1272, 1275, 1284, and 1287 during Kublai Khan's time. The selection of the traveling season was another key that made this voyage so swift. The early navigators from mainland China often utilized the monsoon season to power their seafaring voyages. They usually departed from southern Chinese ports in around December to March and followed the strong north wind heading to Southeast Asia. And then they returned to China from Southeast Asia in around June to July, powered by the south wind. The experienced sailors know how to pinpoint the ship's position. They watch the stars at night and the sun in the day, and when it is cloudy, they use the compass. The magnetic needle compass, the star-guided ocean crossing technique, and the navigation charts had been used for ocean navigation since the time of the Song dynasty from 960 to 1279. During their journey, the Yuan forces took a breather for about a month, stopping off on islands like Pulau Galam. The main reason? They needed to give the soldiers a bit of rest, repair any damaged ships, and build smaller boats. These lighter boats were essential for navigating the narrow, shallow rivers of Java, allowing them to stay mobile and ready for the campaign. This stop also gave commanders time to map out their approach and finalize strategies for tackling Java's tricky terrain. In January 1293, they continued to sail to Karimun Jawa, and from there sailed to Tuban. The Mongols engaged in a series of calculated moves aimed at establishing a foothold in Java, beginning with their immediate pillaging of Tuban and its surroundings. This action served multiple tactical objectives. It was both a show of power intended to subdue local resistance and a practical means to secure supplies. By exerting dominance in Tuban, the Mongols ensured they had a fortified starting point from which to conduct operations further inland and along vital waterways. On the 22nd March, all of the troops gathered in Kali Mas River, which connected to the Brantas River, the primary artery to Singasari's capital, and was the entryway to Java as well. Here, they decided to battle. A Javanese minister blocked the river using boats. The UN commanders then made a crescent-shaped encampment at the bank of the river. They instructed the waterborne troops, cavalry, and infantry to move forward together. The minister abandoned his boats and fled in the night. More than 100 large boats with a devil head at the bow were seized by Yuan forces, providing practical gains, as these boats became assets for transporting troops and supplies further into Java. As soon as he learned of the presence of Yuan forces on Java, Raiden saw a big opportunity to regain power and eliminate his main rival, Jayakatwang of Kadiri. From the start, Raiden saw the Yuan as a potential means to implement his plan. By providing a map of Kadiri, he positioned himself as a cooperative local ally, offering Yuan troops insight into the region while committing to the emperor's demands for allegiance. This allowed him to maintain an appearance of loyalty to the Yuan emperor, even promising tribute, including 2 princesses if the Yuan succeeded in defeating Kadiri. Once the Yuan troops landed, they split forces to effectively cover both logistics and defense. They stationed part of their forces at the Yaqiu Kalimas estuary, securing the river to ensure easy transport of troops and supplies, while the main force advanced inland towards Kadiri. But as they got into formation, a messenger from Raiden burst in with unexpected news. Jayakatwang, Kadiri's ruler, had relentlessly pursued Raiden to Majapahit, and now Raiden was practically begging the Yuan forces for protection. This twist threw the Yuan commanders off balance. They had no idea where Kadiri's army actually was. Every attempt to locate them had come up empty. Forced to reevaluate, they turned back to secure their position at Kalimas, but not long after, Yigmish sent word that Kadiri's forces were expected to arrive that very night. With this surprise move, the Yuan army redirected course, heading swiftly toward Majapahit, prepared to face an enemy that seemed to be everywhere all at once. By April 14th, the Kadiri army indeed advanced on Majapahit from 3 distinct directions, indicating a pincer-like maneuver designed to surround and overrun Raiden's forces. Then, early on April 15th, Yigmish led Yuan troops in an attack against Kadiri, forces supposedly positioned in the southwest. However, his troops encountered no enemy resistance there, suggesting that Kadiri may have moved or used deceptive tactics to lure Yuan forces into an empty area, effectively delaying Yigmish's units from supporting other fronts. Meanwhile, Gao Xing, leading another group of Yuan troops, engaged Kadiri's army in the southeast. After some intense fighting, he managed to drive them back into the mountains, keeping the threat temporarily at bay. However, the enemy wasn't done yet. Around midday, Qadiri's troops reappeared from the southeast, showing they had no intention of backing down. Gao Xing quickly engaged them once more, fighting through to the evening, ultimately achieving a victory. On April 22nd, the Yuan forces developed a multi-directional strategy to overwhelm Qadiri, like what Qadiri did to Raiden. The plan involved splitting into 3 units, each advancing on a different route to encircle Qadiri and rendezvous in Daha by April 26th. The signal to begin the final assault was set to be cannon fire, a common signal used to synchronize military movements at a distance. This setup offered the UN forces both tactical precision and an element of surprise. The first group, choosing a water-based approach, sailed down the river, allowing for rapid, unencumbered movement and a straightforward supply line. Given that river travel would avoid the jungle terrain, this group could potentially arrive in Daha swiftly, even with heavy supplies. Meanwhile, Yigmish's force marched along the eastern riverbank, creating a flanking maneuver. Gao Xing led the Third Army along the western riverbank. This placement provided balance to the eastern troops and ensured that the Yuan army maintained control over both sides of the river. With this positioning, the UN forces could also guard against any ambushes from Qadiri forces who might attempt to divide the Yuan army. Raiden and his troops took up the rear, offering strategic flexibility. His position allowed him to provide reinforcements where needed, respond to Qadiri counterattacks, or even carry out a surprise rear assault if Qadiri tried to flee. This structure highlighted a classic strategy of containment, limiting Qadiri's options and ensuring the UN forces could cover each other's movements effectively. The precision of this setup also reveals the UN commanders' adaptability to Java's challenging geography and their willingness to leverage both river routes and ground forces to maintain the upper hand. On April 26th, the combined UN and Majapahit forces of Raden reached Daha, the stronghold of Qadiri. Inside, the Prince of Qadiri and his troops were bracing themselves for the inevitable clash. The battle began early, around 6 a.m., and stretched on for 8 intense hours. Despite putting up a determined defense, the Qadiri forces couldn't hold up against the 3 successive attacks. By 2 p.m., their lines broke, and many soldiers fled the battlefield. At the same time that the UN troops were pressing from one side, Raiden's Majapahit forces made a strategic move, launching a surprise attack from a different angle. This unexpected assault was the final blow. Qadiri's guards fell quickly, and Raiden pushed his way into the palace. Inside, he rescued the princess, who had been held captive by King Jayakatwang, along with her 2 attendants. It was a huge moment for the Majapahit cause. In the aftermath, as Qadiri's troops attempted to escape, thousands drowned trying to cross the river, and an estimated 5,000 were killed in the battle itself. King Jayakatwang, realizing his defeat, withdrew to his fortress only to find it had already been set aflame. With his last refuge gone, he had no choice but to surrender. By the afternoon, he declared submission, and the Yuan army captured Jayakatwang, his family, and all his high-ranking officers. Once Jayakatwang had been captured by Yuan forces, Raiden returned to Majapahit, ostensibly to prepare his tribute settlement, and left his allies to celebrate their victory. Shibi and Yigmish allowed Raiden to go back to his country to prepare his tribute and a new letter of submission. However, the third commander, Gao Xing, suspected something amiss and warned his fellow generals of Raiden's potential betrayal. His warnings went unheeded, which would soon prove disastrous for the Yuan forces. As part of his ploy, Raiden requested that the Yuan send a small, unarmed delegation to Majapahit, explaining that the princesses he had rescued could not bear the sight of weapons after the long conflict. swayed by his words. 200 UN soldiers, led by their officers, set out for Majapahit without arms, unknowingly walking into a trap. On May 26th, Raden's forces ambushed the unarmed delegation, catching them off guard and eliminating them quickly. Following this successful ambush, Raden didn't stop. He marshaled his forces to attack the Yuan's main camp near Daha, launching a surprise assault that plunged the Yuan forces into disarray. Many Yuan soldiers were killed, and the survivors retreated hastily toward their ships, abandoning the battlefield. Amid the chaos, Shibi found himself separated from his troops and had to fight through 193 kilometers of hostile terrain to reach safety. During this retreat, the Yuan army not only suffered heavy casualties, but also lost a significant amount of loot they had collected during their campaign. Raden's guerrilla tactics proved highly effective. He avoided a direct confrontation, instead choosing to repeatedly strike at the Yuan forces' weaknesses. By constantly harassing the retreating soldiers and inflicting small but cumulative losses, he ensured that the Yuan army would remember this campaign as a costly disaster. This strategic victory showcased Raden's cunning and decisiveness, ultimately securing Majapahit's independence while leaving the Yuan forces with a bitter lesson. Realizing they were outmatched and without a clear path forward, the Yuan forces began a chaotic retreat. To add to their troubles, they faced an urgent timeline. The monsoon winds, which they needed to sail back home, were nearing their end. If they missed this window, they'd be stranded on the island for another 6 months, vulnerable to further attacks. They chose to withdraw, taking with them Jayakatwang and his son as captives. However, before they departed, the Yuan executed Jayakatwang and his son, ensuring Majapahit had no rival claimant left. The Yuan fleet departed on May 31st. Historical records, like the Kudadu inscription, suggest a naval skirmish took place between the retreating Yuan fleet and a Javanese fleet commanded by Arya Adhikara, which led to the capture or destruction of several Mongol ships. The Yuan fleet lost more than 3,000 soldiers, with modern researchers estimating that 60% of the Yuan army was killed during the campaign. The estimated losses ranged from 12,000 to 18,000 soldiers, with an unknown number of prisoners and captured or destroyed ships. In August 1293, the Yuan fleet returned to China after their unsuccessful campaign in Java. They brought prisoners, detailed maps, population records, and a letter with golden inscriptions from the king of Muli, likely Bali. The fleet also carried treasures like incense, perfumes, textiles, and other goods valued at over 500,000 taels of silver. While these riches were impressive, they couldn't make up for the expedition's failure. The costly campaign gained the Mongols little and left them with a strong new rival in Southeast Asia. This was the last military expedition of Kublai Khan's reign, marking the end of his ambitions to expand Mongol influence into the region. On the other hand, Majapahit, the Javanese kingdom that successfully resisted the Mongols, emerged stronger than ever. Their victory over such a powerful empire boosted their status, helping them become the most dominant state in Southeast Asia during their time. However, the encounter wasn't just about warfare. It also led to important innovations in shipbuilding. The Javanese adopted Chinese techniques and combined them with their own skills to create a new type of ship known as the Zhong. These ships were a blend of Javanese and Chinese technology. They used iron nails along with traditional wooden dowels, had watertight bulkheads for safety, and featured a central rudder to improve steering. These new ships gave the Javanese an advantage at sea, helping them strengthen their maritime power and expand their trade networks. The fusion of Chinese and Javanese ideas wasn't just practical. It changed the way ships were built in the region and set the stage for future dominance in Southeast Asia. Although the Mongols failed in their campaign, the legacy of their encounter with Java lived on. Majapahit rose to power, and the exchange of knowledge and technology left a lasting impact, shaping the region's history for generations.